Thank you, Crystal. So firstly, good evening and welcome everyone to our 7th and final event in the Brennan Justice Talk series. And tonight we're focusing on pursuing a legal career in social justice. My name is Dr. Elise Methven and I am Zooming in this evening from Wongal country, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Brennan program. The Brennan Justice and Leadership Program, and I am joined here by a few members of our Brennan team. So of course, you will know one of my fellow co-directors from the UTS LSS, Georgina Hedge, and also Crystal McLaughlin, our Brennan Administrator. And also I'm joined this evening by our Dean, Leslie Hitchens, and most importantly for this evening, our special guests and panelists this evening, who are Alison Whittaker, Zaahir Anthony and Zaahir Edries, and we'll be hearing a bit more about them shortly. But before we do, I would also like to say that we're very fortunate this evening to be joined by UTS Elder in Residence, Auntie Glendra Stubbs, who will do the acknowledgement of country for us. So thank you so much, Glendra.
Thank you, Elise. Can you see me?
We can see you and hear you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm thinking I've only got that funky picture there. So great. Thank you. Yalamandu Marang Galindera. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the land of the Darug and Gundungurra people and say thanks for me living a lifetime here. UTS is part of Gadigal and Eora Nation, and so I pay respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and say thanks for allowing UTS to be on their land. The University of Technology is built where it's built. As we share our knowledge, learning and research practice within this university, may we pay respects to the knowledge embedded forever within our culture. I also like to pay respects to elders, past, present, and our emerging elders, and say thanks for the way they've looked after us and for their struggles that they've had. Also, present elders and ones who are, and the young ones who are proud to be the emerging elders. I also want to say thanks to our non-Indigenous brothers and sisters who walk with us on this journey for social justice. As some of you might know, I did a big stint with the Royal Commission into institutional child abuse, and what became very apparent to me was that that Aboriginal people had to learn to trust lawyers, because they'd only been in their lives or when they were in trouble with the law or when child protection was involved. But I need to say that, you know, the social justice warriors that are lawyers now are earning that trust. And now it's like, you know, they're embracing lawyers, you know. And, you know, you're doing a wonderful job, an absolute wonderful job. And you know, I said the other day to the magistrates when I was doing some training with them, that the lawyers that are coming through, that have learned about our trauma and our past, are social justice warriors. So don't any of you forget that you are social justice warriors. And it's the hardest to engage people in Australia. We are engaging with you guys. And, you know, I'd like to say, you know, and including in my friend list, Taralia and Alison. So big hugs to you all. And keep up the good work. We need you guys.
Thank you so much, Auntie Glendra. And I think they're really inspiring words for students, and also clearly remind us of the responsibility we have as lawyers and future lawyers and legal scholars as well. So thank you for that. So tonight we have the unique pleasure of being connected with UTS Law students across multiple years, all passionate about the topic of social justice. So I'm going to, as always, lay out a few Zoom housekeeping rules for this evening. So this Zoom event is being recorded for teaching and learning and research purposes. Only key speakers and those that are asking questions in the discussion will come up in the Zoom. You should have the ability to hide and show your camera, as well as mute and unmute your microphone. When you are not speaking, please make sure you put your microphone on mute. If you find the event is freezing due to your bandwidth, you might want to turn your camera off just to make sure that it works and free up that bandwidth. And also tonight, we expect quite a lot of the Brennan community to tune in, and we'd love to see your lovely faces. So if you can turn on your cameras, wonderful. If not, we understand that as well. So especially if you're asking a question, we'd love to see your face, but we also understand if we can't for whatever reason. And lastly, a very important request for current students, make sure that you claim your 5 ROJ points by putting your full name now in the chat box. So just note that you can use that chat box also for asking questions this evening. Now, with all that housekeeping settled, I would love to introduce you to our distinguished guests and panel members, some of whom I'm sure you'll be familiar with. So firstly, we have Gomeroi poet, lawyer, and senior researcher at Jumbunna Indigenous House of Learning at UTS, Alison Whittaker, whose work draws attention to the systemic failings and racism of the Australian criminal justice system and contributes to our knowledge around Aboriginal deaths in custody. So welcome, Alison. Secondly, we have lawyer and General Counsel at GetUp, Zaahir Edries, and as Zaahir said, also a long-term friend of mine who I went through law school with. And Zaahir is executive member of and former president of the Muslim Legal Network, whose work centers around advocating for social justice and inclusion. And last but not least, many of you will know legal academic Professor Zaahir Edries, whose research expertise in criminal law and Indigenous peoples and the law has informed policy and debates in relation to systemic change and seeking systemic change and remedies for wrongs inflicted on Indigenous communities. So welcome also to Zaahir. All right, so I will now stop sharing the screen and I will ask the first question for this evening, which is for both Alison and Zaahir. And perhaps Alison would like to answer this one first. So you are both UTS Law graduates. Can you tell us a bit about your career trajectory after you graduated from UTS Law, and how do you use your law degree in your current work? Thanks.
So yeah, yama everybody, I'm Alison Whittaker, I'm a Gomeroi woman. Just want to acknowledge before we get any further that I'm here on Gadigal Mongol country. I want to take the chance to acknowledge their elders and ancestors and their continued sovereignty over this place. I was very pleased and honoured to graduate from UTS relatively recently, so my trajectory is very short. So I graduated in 2016, and it was this kind of, momentous occasion at times. I want to encourage anybody who's here, I've been in your shoes, and at times it does seem insurmountable. And those were in pretty ordinary times. I accept that most of you here are studying during really extraordinary times, and I just want to urge you on as much as I can. You do get to the end eventually. After I graduated, I went straight to do a graduate certificate in legal practice and got about halfway through that before I disappeared to the other side of the world, to Turtle Island, North America, where I went on to do some further study on a Fulbright scholarship, which is where most of the research that I've done to date on First Nations deaths in custody and how they track through review systems on this continent. That's effectively where that research was cultivated, having got a little bit of space from just reacting in the day-to-day. But in that intervening period, I was working as a researcher. I was really, really lucky to have the mentorship of Thalia, who I'm sure is going to be very humble about her role in this, but was one of the first people to introduce me to the idea of scholarship in particular as a vehicle for social change, and legal scholarship in particular as having a responsibility to the community that it purports to serve. So I want to thank you. It would be very remiss of me to not actually mention that, Thalia. Now I've got you here on the call. Yeah, and from there I returned. I'm now working at the Jumbunna Institute. Clearly UTS has had a pull on me, so you can go very far with a law degree from UTS, or you can of course just hang around as much as you like. It's really up to you. But the work that I do at the Jumbunna Institute is, like many jobs, I suppose, that are facing our generation of graduates from law school, really quite diffuse, having kind of a mixed campaigning role, a mixed advisory role, that's essentially just about making sure First Nations communities are heard, as well as bringing their legal interests onto a political agenda, a campaign agenda, as well as to formal courts, especially in the coroner's court, which is where my specialty currently lies. So the career trajectory has been short, diffuse, and has landed me right back in the tower. I'm sure Zaahir has maybe a more wide-ranging experience than I have.
Thank you, Alison, so much. And Zaahir, would you like to share a bit about your career trajectory after graduating from UTS Law?
Yeah, sure, thanks. I just want to, like the speaker before me, just acknowledge that I'm dialing in from stolen land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people here in Sydney. And for me, I often do this because it's really important that a lot of my social justice context comes from growing up in Perth, and I was born in South Africa as well. So I grew up on Noongar land, and I made friends with elders there very early, because that was a connection that I, as an African migrant, found myself making really early on, and I'm humbled to be here with you deadly people. So thanks for having me. Very quickly, in terms of my career trajectory, it's probably important to know that I came to UTS as a postgrad, and as a postgrad, I came because it was important to me that the university, and this is not what I'm saying just because the dean is on here, it was a really accommodating place for me. I came in, I moved to Sydney by myself, so being able to study law in the evenings, do what was then called the Masters of Law and Legal Practice, it's since been converted to the JD, was really important for me, and it sort of set my path to doing this social justice work, because the subjects that I was able to do really helped me fine-tune what I wanted to do in the future. That being said, my career trajectory is bizarre and strange, probably out of necessity. I've been an investigator since graduating. I have worked on royal commissions. I have worked in private practice at top-tier law firms. I've worked in specialist law firms, and I found myself now at GetUp as its General Counsel. That's a very short version, and I might tell you a couple of interesting bits which you as students might find entertaining or think I'm mad, but either way, I'm going to tell you anyway. I graduated about in August, I think it was. In 2008, I was finishing off an investigator role, which I think is quite important because the skills you learn were really quite helpful for me to be a government investigator. I was a workplace conduct investigator at RailCorp. I did work closely with, believe it or not, with New South Wales ICAC, quite topical right now. And that was a really interesting start to my career. I then, like many graduates, moved into a graduate type program. For those of you old enough to know, 2008 was a difficult year for graduates of any degree. We had this little thing called the global financial crisis, which meant graduate positions went from 40 at PwC, for example, to 3. So interestingly, I had to think about how I would engage in a career that I necessarily may have thought, like many people, you want to do, you know, I did my Masters of Law and Legal Practice in international law, which was really interesting, but also there aren't many jobs for international human rights lawyers in Australia, believe it or not. That being said, it doesn't mean you can't do the work. What I mean by that was, outside of my job, I didn't want to sit on my laurels and think, how do I get a job during a global recession? And a bunch of my colleagues started what Alise alluded to at the beginning when she introduced me, was the Muslim Legal Network of New South Wales. At the time, we were combating some really difficult counterterrorism legislation around the country. We formed this, I guess, a supportive network, which quickly evolved into an advocacy space. My legal practice helped work in that campaign space, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later on. That quickly progressed into, and was able to sharpen some of my skills as a graduate lawyer. I moved through private practice for maybe about a decade. I moved into in-house work, which I also found really satisfying. And it allowed me to think about different things and apply my legal brain different ways. Also, all of that NGO type work is ultimately what got me to GetUp. If you're a lawyer who works in this space, you're often touted as a troublemaker or I'd like to think we're more people who like to stir up the status quo, which I think is really important in our profession and in our space, because if we don't, nothing changes. And yeah, so for the last 3 years, I found myself living in this little space, admiring the work of Zaahir and Alison, and seeing them speak at places like, you know, Red Law, and just really fascinating about what we can do with a law degree in this day and age. Thanks, Lise.
Thanks, Zaahir. Obviously, we'll have a lot of questions on those issues later. I'd also now like to ask Zaahir, can you explain why you decided to pursue a career as a legal academic, and what led you to focus your research on criminal justice and First Nations people and the law?
Thanks, Elise. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on unceded Wongal land of the Eora Nation, and especially thank the amazing Auntie Glendra for her acknowledgement as well. And I just also have to put it out there that although Alison claims not to have moved far from the tower, she's constantly on the front line and connected with community. And that's a testament to Alison's work, as well as the work of Jumbunna at UTS. So to answer your question, Elise, and probably the second part first, my journey to becoming a legal academic, is not really orthodox. I studied arts law, and then halfway through put my law degree on hold to do my PhD in history. And that was on colonial histories in the Northern Territory, especially for cattle station workers. And part of that was looking at the role of legislation and case law in that process of colonisation. So I came to the law being really conscious of historical legacies in oppressing First Nations people. But I also, and just to give away my age, grew up in the 1980s when racist policing and deaths in custody were becoming national issues. And I was, as a child, part of the protests at the time and really saw that injustice. And when I studied law, it was about, identifying the injustice, but also trying to work out how the law can be a weapon for accountability and for change. And it's this constant, I guess, dialectic between law enforcing, as you say, Zaahir, the status quo, but also pushing back on it. In terms of my motivation for being a law academic, it was really to be a lecturer, to teach students. So I initially did this in history and then in law. And today, a lot of the work I do, as I see it in justice, is really in the classroom. And, you know, Wiradjuri women like Laura Lyons and Annie Bronwyn Penrith constantly remind me about knowledge being power. So I mean, obviously we do social justice advocacy in the community, but I never underestimate that day-to-day engagement with students. And I think, you know, having started as a lecturer and continually being grateful for that opportunity, I also got to see the social justice work of my colleagues. And it's why in 2010 I came to UTS, because of the work Jumbunna and Larissa Barrett were doing against the Northern Territory intervention, and centres like anti-slavery were doing in the law faculty. And to see how you could be an activist in your work was just astonishing to me, you know, that you could have this as a job, because activism was always just part of, you know, my life. And to think that my job could mirror that, I see as a real privilege and responsibility. So I guess my, you know, coming to this career, so to speak, kind of found me as much as I found it.
Thank you, Thalia. And I also want to acknowledge that Thalia has had a big influence on my career as well. So, and I'm sure a lot of students here as well. So now my question is for all panelists, and I'm happy for anyone to jump in for this first question. So are there any particular campaigns or projects that you are working on right now that challenges an area of injustice? If so, can you provide a brief overview of this campaign and why it is, or this project, and why it is particularly significant in a social or political sense at this present time? Everyone's too polite. I might ask her.
Look, I can honestly, I can talk on this question for like 3 hours, but I'm going to try and keep it succinct. So the short version of this is, and I alluded to it in the introduction. So I've fell into this work around counterterrorism legislation, knowing that in my undergrad, I studied criminology and legal studies. So my work was exposure to the criminal justice system, or as sometimes my friends call it, the criminal injustice system, because there's nothing just about it. Anyway, we'll get there. What I found in my community as someone who identifies as Muslim is that in around the time I graduated, actually, and around the time we formed the Muslim Legal Network, there was significant exposure around pieces of legislation that were contrary to commonly held understandings of civil liberties in Australia and around the world. Australia has enacted a number of, and I would say it's in the dozens of pieces of legislation that are geared towards national security and have been, if I'm frank, targeted towards the Muslim or minority communities in Australia. We know this because of the way people have been charged. We know this because traditionally this is how they've been reported. Why that's important and why that's something that's still going on is we know that those sorts of things are intrinsically related to how race and power plays into policy making. And it's in a lot of ways transitioned into what, even though I don't specifically campaign on this work at GetUp at the moment, it is so intertwined with our democracy work, because you can't separate what we loosely call the democratic process from racist policy or racist implementation of that policy. So when we talk about civil liberties at GetUp, and we talk about something that we've just recently done, which was the democracy dossier or the democracy report, which people may have seen, it's about 90 pages long. There's a YouTube video of me, Scott Ludlam, a few of the academics from UNSW speaking about it, if anyone's interested. But what it does is it demonstrates in a very matter-of-fact way just how poor Australia's observance to what most people around the world would see as something really simple. You know, I mean, we know in Australia there's no inherent right to free speech. It comes out as a result of some case law. But when we go down that rabbit hole, we really see that there are there's a lot of work to be done around this particular area, and it's ongoing work. The unfortunate thing is we see these different pieces of legislation where sunset clauses keep getting rolled over for, every few years. It comes up in a pandemic, for example. Most people don't know there have been half a dozen sunset clauses that have been automatically rolled over the last 18 months. Like, this is extraordinary. We're talking about the ability to detain a 14-year-old without charge, hold them and not tell their parents. There are extraordinary things occurring, and I think it would be remiss of me not to mention that as an important campaign, because I think it's really emblematic of how we as a profession, and if we want to talk about social justice, really understanding where our power lies, and our power lies in challenging the power that we create and we reinforce as being a part of the system. So there's like a whole thinking that needs to go behind it. And we don't do it generally as lawyers. I'm trying to do it more so in my work. But yeah, so that's probably one of the more interesting things that I'm working on at the moment that, GetUp's doing, that I think is really important. We should be speaking about, and we shouldn't necessarily just be going blindly into it. I mentioned earlier that I was an investigator, and I think a lot of lawyers or people who want to do social change or social justice have a real closeness to wanting to see justice. So we almost get drawn to policing in some way, we want to serve justice. And then we very quickly pull ourselves away because we realize policing is often attached to the injustice that's served on our communities. So when we talk about democracy and civil liberties, we can't necessarily talk about power and injustice and how that influence is really stigmatizing a lot of communities. Selfishly love my community, but like I said at the start, I work quite closely even at GetUp with our First Nations communities, and I think we really need to recognise that. But I'll let Alison and Talia no doubt speak about that issue.
So I actually don't work on any kind of grand unified campaign. A lot of the work that I do is concentrated on serving directly families, First Nations families who've experienced the death of a loved one in custody. And there was a report released today that had finally crunched the official numbers that said, since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody back 30 years ago in 1991, there have been 471 First Nations deaths in custody up until the end of 2020. And we know in the intervening period, there's been another 14. And so, of course, that's really quite diffuse work in the sense that every death and every family must be honoured in the work that you are bringing them along with. It also means that every time you encounter, every time you are kind of meeting people in these review systems, you're trying to guide them through. You're also trying to help them do things that I guess you could describe as not being served by the legal system, actually trying to build campaigns that put, whether or not this is something we can kind of openly talk about as lawyers or as legally minded people, actually kind of put a political campaign pressure on the design of the courts to make them more just, or on these review processes to make them more just. So one example in which a family is kind of led through these mandatory inquests that happen after a death in custody, and has been met with hostility. Virtually all First Nations families are met with some kind of hostility in these review systems, but one family who has born an extremely exceptional version of this cruelty is the family of Wayne Fella Morrison and Latoya Rule, his sibling, who is actually a PhD student and scholar here at UTS. And that the circumstances of Fella's death, just a heads up, I'm going to talk about them, was that he was restrained in a hog-tied position with his arms and legs behind him. He was placed face down in a van with a spit hood placed over his head. And in the period in which there was no CCTV coverage of what happened to Fella, he lost consciousness and he passed away a few days later in an ICU unit. And the immense difficulty, in addition to the horror and trauma of his death and his loss in his own right, was that the guards who put him in the back of the van refused to speak. And to this day still refuse to speak, claiming a novel penalty privilege a right to protect themselves against professional consequences, not criminal ones, including things like pay deductions or reprimand in their workplace. But one in this space, obviously, because as has already been noted, there's this huge power dynamic that means a lot of what you do in social justice lawyering is lining up to lose, and lose with dignity, and lose in a principled way. There was a victory in this case, and it was because that family had organised so specifically and in their power, understanding the limitations of the system and in honour of somebody who they loved, to get a legislative ban on spit hoods, like those that were placed on Fella's head, through the South Australian Parliament. And so to my understanding, that's the first time there's been an all settings ban on the use of spit hoods that's enshrined in legislation across all custodial and medical settings in the state, which is obviously not complete justice that they're seeking, but one incredible way that concerted organising, including where there's a role for lawyers, can actually achieve really tangible outcomes in unexpected places, in this case, certainly not in a court that has been resisting them at every move. So that's an example of, I suppose, a campaign that's been very topical because it's happened so recently, but also that demonstrates just a model of not quite hope, but a model of possibility for how we can do this kind of lawyering going forward. And it has me really excited for what's possible, acknowledging, of course, that with every First Nations death in custody is this new wave, these new wounds being opened in our community. And while these are crucial points for us to carry people through as lawyers who are doing kind of direct service work, or as campaigners who are doing direct service work, they're not just opportunities for change, but opportunities to hold close the dignity and the sorriness of those families as well.
Yeah, wow. So I guess my campaign, if I were to focus on one at the moment, is on COVID in prisons. So it's probably doing some of the work before it gets to the stage that Alison's campaigning is around. So trying to stop deaths in custody as a result of COVID. We know that prisons are inherently unsafe places, and especially unsafe for First Nations people due to systemic racism in the quality of care and the level of care. And I think the gravity of the situation with COVID has brought together families, justice organisations, prisoner advocates, and First Nations organisations like Deadly Connections in New South Wales. So we've been working on trying to especially release people from prison because they're overcrowded environments which give rise to the rapid transmission of diseases like COVID. And indeed, last month we saw an outbreak of Delta, and it's continuing every day. There are new cases. I think today or yesterday there were 5 new cases. And last month there were over 400 COVID cases in prisons in Sydney. And this rate was at one point in time 10 times the transmission in prison than the general community. So the risk is much greater, and yet of course these people have no choice to be there. Their loved ones are in absolute fear for their lives. And in addition to that, the way that it's been managed is through lockdowns. So keeping people in their cell, we've heard, for 24 hours a day for several days, not even having the opportunity to shower. So there's lots of demands around the conditions in prison and also the risk of dying from COVID. And just from, unfortunately, really personal experience with my auntie, I know that even a hospital in the community, an ICU ward, and a ventilator might not save your life. And they don't have any of those things in prison. So it's a really critical situation, and some of the things we've been doing include, well, obviously bringing families together for support, trying to advocate to corrections management and the government to have conditions improved, such as ensuring a tablet to every person in prison for digital visits. We're also running a legal case in the Supreme Court in 2 weeks, and we've appeared at parliamentary hearings and had press conferences and continue to share information on a Facebook site we moderate. So we're trying to, I guess, use legal avenues, but also use other social and political organisational avenues. And we've had, I mean, it's not been, I guess, the clear type of victory that Alison referred to, but I think we've had success in the sense that prison numbers have rapidly increased in the last couple of months. And so judicial officers and parole boards are awakened to these issues that we're trying to keep, you know, in the public's attention. But it's been a struggle, you know, it's prisons, and Alison's research very much speaks to this. They're something that are filled generally with silence in the papers, in the digital media and on the TV, and in the overwhelming, I guess, COVID news cycle, prisons rarely feature. So it's been a challenge, but I think that it's gaining momentum, and I think the legal case will be another tool in our toolbox to ensure that the rights of people in prisons are not forgotten and that they have a voice as much as possible.
Thank you, Thalia, and thank you everyone for sharing those really personal and important stories. I'm just going to ask one more question because I also want to ensure there's time for student questions. And so that will be to any panel member. Can you, in your experience, what are some of the ways in which the law or the justice system can either reproduce injustice or alternatively be used to challenge injustice? And I'll ask Alison first.
Yeah, you got to pick on us. I don't think any of us will volunteer. Yeah, it's a really fantastic question. The answer is, in all ways, it can be either. And what's required is a really principled vigilance as social justice practitioners, whether we are engaged in the formal practice of law, whether we're engaged in campaigning, community organising, if we're doing in-house work. It requires vigilance, not just about the impact or like the relative impact that we think we can make in the world, but also the forums to which we choose to ventilate them and the methods that we use to get things through. Yeah, I don't think we're going to have time to cover it today, but it's the moment that you stop wrestling with these questions, I think, is when you have the capacity to do real harm on a grand scale. And what's really, really critical is that you continue to wrestle with, I guess, the way that you engage with the law and whether you are creating injustice or whether you are using the small bit of capacity that I think settler law has to push back and to minimise the harm on our communities.
And Zaahir, would you like to add any observations there?
I think without going over what Alison said, which I agree with completely, I'll give this perspective, and that is because there's a lot of students online, you'll find challenges in your career, particularly early on, with respect to what I like to call the question of integrity, if you're going to go down this path. The question of integrity revolves around whether or not you're willing in your heart of hearts, and you won't know the answer. Like we just said, it's a constant learning and a constant educating yourself. And if you ever stop, you're in trouble because that means you've given up on, you know, teaching yourself something new. But I might just say, because we know the law has as a system has the potential to do harm, unfortunately, because people aren't balanced in, even though Lady Justice is blind and the scales are supposed to be, you know, even, we know that you don't come we don't come the same way to the law. And I think if you're ever in a place where something feels wrong in your gut, and as ridiculous as this sounds, I'm sure my panelists will agree with me, when it feels wrong, it probably is wrong. So you need to think about whether or not, if you're going to live in this space of social justice, are you willing to stop and think back to, it's a really bad reference point, but I do it all the time. Often my parents used to say to me when I wanted to become a lawyer, the law was one of the first professions, and it was like medicine, the law, and the clergy. And the reason they say that is because it was supposed to be you're servicing something greater than yourself. And I think that's the approach we take in sort of social justice, or what we now is often termed movement lawyering. What is the service you're doing? Is it taking this greater practice forward? If it's not, you have that question of integrity. And do you want to sit there and think, what does my integrity say about me in the decision I'm about to make? And often that will guide you as to whether or not the law is helping you or hindering you. It's not a real answer, but it's a feeling that I think it took me 15 years of practice to get on top of, and I'm still working on it now. So I thought I'll give everyone here a head start. Zaahir?
No, they were really brilliant answers about kind of the, I guess the way in which we negotiate our relationship with the law and perceive the law. And what I wanted to add is that while it's really clear to me, and I get a lot of my impressions of, and they're deep feelings, often deep feelings of outrage of what injustice is. I get those from people I work with, people who are affected by injustice. While it might be clear to me, we shouldn't take for granted these terms, justice and injustice, because for some people, the rule of law, which can in many ways uphold power and privilege, is a system of justice. And many people who work in the law would say they work with integrity. So for me, the way I perceive it is more around what the law does to uphold or challenge structural relationships, especially relationships of oppression. And it's about identifying where you see yourself in that relationship. Because I don't think anyone would, I know going to Sydney University, it was so normalised that you would go into a large firm as a clerk, and no one would ever say that they were going on to do the work of injustice. So I think, when we talk about social justice, we're talking about something that is about the broader community and the broader society, and how that is affected by laws. And that is, and how we work that out is by being engaged in the broader community. It's really difficult to make those kinds of judgment calls from the sidelines. And I would say once you get too embedded in a profession, it's hard to do that critical work. So the critical work needs to start now. And I think students are, as students, I wouldn't say you should be thinking about a future career in social justice. What I would say is social justice should just be something that is part of your life. And some of the most amazing social change in the world has happened through student movements. So don't underestimate your own power, and that will help you navigate, I guess, how the law works and what your role in it will be.
Thank you, Thalia. I might hand over to Georgina now to field questions from the audience.
Yeah, of course. And thank you so much to our panelists. I think those insights were absolutely amazing. So we've got a few questions coming in on the chat, which I'll be able to read out. But if anyone wants to ask a question to our panelists live face-to-face, feel free to use the raise hand function and I can call upon you. But if you're not comfortable, we're totally happy to, you can listen to my voice and I can read out the questions. So we have a first question from Melanie, and I think that this is probably a question a lot of students might have. what are some things university students can do in commencing change when we are not yet in roles such as you all are? So yeah, if any of the panelists want to contribute to that one.
It's not always like something that's replicable, because I know people, it's much more difficult now, and I also know that a lot of people have to work and to take up their own time, that they're not studying to get through university. But a really critical thing that you can do, and we don't want to discount like direct service work to the community, is go and volunteer for community legal centres, do a lot of paralegal work. It has the added benefit of helping you develop that sense of intuition that we were just talking about, as well as beginning to understand and maybe even make explicit like your values and how they relate to the process of law, as well as a very practical matter, just developing skills that are going to be really, really useful in this toolkit. Because it's all very well to kind of go in with principles blazing, but actually there's sometimes a practical matter of making sure that you're useful to the communities that you're serving as well. So I personally cut my teeth at the ALS office in Parramatta. Immensely valuable work, and I would encourage anybody to do the same.
Amazing, thank you, Alison. Oh, thanks, Talia.
To say that we run a subject called strategic litigation. It's run by Craig Longman, and I support him. Craig Longman is based at Jumbunna as a senior researcher. And part of that is getting an understanding of doing community-led work, especially with First Nations communities. So I'd really encourage people to look at that subject. And yeah, just kind of being part of those organisations is a great experience for you, but often it's really valuable for the organisations as well. So I think it's a really good way to immerse yourself in something that is really part of building the field, because social justice, and Zaahir said this, it's something that you might get paid for, but a lot of those centres continue to rely on pro bono or volunteer work, even as legal graduates. And even if you do take a path that, you know, might, for example, be in a law firm, there's nothing that means you can't continue with these opportunities. And I'm sure that, you know, many of those services would value from having those types of skills.
Thank you, Thalia. Zaahir, did you want to add anything to that, or no? All good. Okay, amazing. Well, the next question is directed to Zaahir anyway. So Rebecca has a question for you, Zaahir. She asked, when you were in private practice for 10 years, was this mainly revolved around commercial law? And if so, did you still know that your heart was in social justice? And then she says that she feels as though law students are often steered towards a commercial law career, which is something we've kind of all discussed tonight. But I know it's not for me, and that her heart is still in social justice.
What a great question. Thanks, Rebecca. I asked the same question when I was studying. I'll tell you what I did, because I can't speak for everyone else. I got a job as a paralegal. I worked sort of out of necessity, but I also began gauging what I was doing. I didn't work in commercial law. I was a litigator, and it was a deliberate decision for me not to work in M&A or mergers and acquisitions. I actually geared my way towards litigation, largely because I understood, and I think, you know, if people go and do the strategic litigation course, I don't know about it, but I'm sure you will find out that strategic litigation is quite literally you know, avenues of litigation, be they commercial litigation or targeted litigation in the climate space, or in any space that is important. So to answer your question, yes, my heart has always been in social change and social justice. I don't think that will ever change. Like, I think that was decided before I was born. Like in apartheid South Africa, I had no choice, right? I came here and that was it. It was done. Protest when I was 5, you know, it's been going ever since. But the reality is, and as much as, you know, Order of Law says you can't use the master's tools to, you know, break down the system, et cetera, you do need to learn it. And I'm really proud of the fact that I worked at a top tier law firm for a couple of reasons. I worked at a top tier law firm where I was the only visibly Muslim person there. Like, and that for me was important because I was the first visibly, you know, identifying Muslim person there in the legal team. And that was important in and of itself. So the reason I mention that is when you appear as a solicitor who has a social conscience, for example, you actually change the environment you're in. Like, you impact that environment that you're in. So don't think, if you think I can stick it out for maybe 2 years, do my grad rotations, you will learn great things. I'm still applying the same tedious, stickler for detail in certain things now that I learned in 2007 and 2008 when I was, between 2008 to 2010 as grad, because I knew it was important. And those things I'm using now working at GetUp. Those things I'm now using when I'm, responding to government notices, trying to do all of those little bits and pieces. I think it's really important that we recognize where our heart is, but we also realize that we work and play in a system that is not necessarily built for social justice. We've got to push it and force it and massage it that way. So I hope that helps, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Zaahir. Alison or Thalia, did you have any comments on that question? Or no? Amazing. Thank you so much. And yeah, I think those sentiments are really important for those of us progressing in our law degree, when sometimes it can feel like the corporate world is this big, bad, crazy place and we don't really know how to maneuver it. So Margaret has a question, which is a bit broader, zooming out a little bit. And it's just very simply, what challenges do we still face today when reaching justice? So a bit of a broader one to change the way a bit. So maybe Alison or Thalia, if you wanted to comment on that one.
So much. One of the recent, this is probably a critical campaign that everybody here should be concerned with, is recent changes to charity regulations that actually impact the capacity of not-for-profits who rely on tax-deductible status to engage in the kind of movement lawyering that we know actually makes a difference. So maybe I will send around a link to some information about that in that campaign, because that's a direct attack on our capacity to mobilise. And it's not really a surprise that it came after this massive growth in people talking about Black Lives Matter, First Nations deaths in custody that we saw come about in the middle of June last year, which was very much enabled by the not-for-profit sector, who in that moment, to their credit, did something very brave and bold in a period of great hostility. So I will share some links to that with you later on.
Thalia or Zaahir, if you wanted to comment on that one as well, maybe? No? Okay. So maybe I think we have another question from Sai, which is, what is the role of the criminal justice system in providing alternative avenues for convicted individuals to not add to the prison problem and the issues which come with being in prison or detention? So maybe Thalia, if you wanted to comment on that one.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think it's been on a lot of people's lives, especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, that's exposed the harms of the criminal system and prisons. And with that movement, there has been a lot of talk about abolition and imagining a world without prisons, on the basis that it's not simply about liberty, it's really about building communities and building safety, and that prisons are not safe places. So what a lot of these proponents of abolition talk about are building, for example, mutual aid, where we have communities that support one another. Many people who end up in prison, not only do they face issues of, say, discrimination or bias in the stages of policing, or even as Elise can talk to how we define offences like offensive language and how they're policed, but also because they have a lack of opportunities to things that many of us take for granted, such as housing, education, employment, a regular income. So if we looked at all of these issues and we focused, investment and resources on those types of, basic rights, really, I think we would redress a lot of the underlying issues. But but also that, you know, there's the problem, you know, the tragic issue of trauma that many people who come to prison have, and prison often re-traumatizes rather than deals with underlying traumas. It's not a system that is proven to reduce offending, for instance. Indeed, going to prison is often a way to increase offending. So I think we need to accept the shortcomings of prison and look at other systems that need to be buttressed. And I know in Victoria, for example, where they're looking at building a new women's prison, they have a campaign called Homes Not Prisons. Is that right, Alison? And so there's a lot of attention to these underlying issues. And I think we need to also remember that the great majority of people in prison are not serious offenders. And in fact, they're there for very short times, often less than 6 months. So we totally dislocate people. You know, they may lose their homes, they may lose their children, their jobs, and then we put them back in society, you know, with very little. So it's not it's the opposite of building communities. So I think there are alternatives that we need to think about as a society. And I guess I would just say that I do feel like I have a lot of issues with crime. I don't want to suggest that I tolerate crime, but what I'm concerned with is the crime we tend to focus on, which tends to be a lot of personal property minor crimes rather than some of the major crimes of corporations and the state. For example, when a mining corporation blows up a sacred site, we don't imprison anyone on the board. And so I think we really have to rethink the criminal law paradigm, the prison paradigm, and have a vision about what society we want.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dahlia. Did anyone else want to make some final comments before we wrap up for tonight? Amazing. Well, on that note, on behalf of the UTS Faculty of Law, the UTS Law Student Society, and all the students here tonight, I would like to thank our three panelists, Alison, Dahlia, and Zaahir, for sharing their knowledge and comments with us tonight. I know I can definitely speak on behalf of all the students here that it was inspiring to hear your insights about pursuing a career in social justice. As we've discussed, especially in this time, it can be extremely difficult for us as students to conceptualize the best way to be able to pursue a career in social justice. So thank you for giving us your insights on your own experience and providing us with a look into what community level change actually looks like. So thank you again. A big thank you to Crystal, Beck, Mac, Renata, Elise, Erica, and the entire Social Justice and Brennan team for helping to administrate the event tonight. Thank you as well to our Dean, Leslie Hitchens, Maxine Evers, and other members of the faculty for joining us. We encourage all participants here to act on the tips learnt tonight and Google their community legal centres and seek out any volunteering opportunities which you can claim LTS for. We always post new and exciting opportunities on the Brennan Collective, so we would encourage you all to get involved with that. A reminder to all participants that they will receive 5 ROJ for attending this evening's event, and we encourage all Brennanites to keep their eyes peeled for our Brennan Summer Circle for 2021 and 2022 with some exciting new opportunities involved within the Summer Circle. So thank you, a big thank you again to our panelists and to everyone attending. We can't wait to see you in 2022 for another great year of justice talks. So thank you everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Georgina. Thanks, everyone. Thank you to our panelists as well. It's been such an interesting discussion. I felt it went too quickly, but I do encourage all the Brennanites, I didn't know that was a word, to go and follow our panel members, Thalia, Zaahir, and Alison, and the work that they do. You can follow them on Twitter and various other channels as well. So please do that. I hope you all stay safe, everyone, and have a lovely evening. Thanks again.